History has a pattern. Every time a government faces a serious crisis, economic collapse, war, civil unrest, or something it simply decides qualifies as an emergency, the response follows a remarkably predictable script. And ordinary people, every single time, are caught off guard by it. So today we're covering the first 10 things they seize in a crisis and how to hide them. Thing 10. Firearms and ammunition. Let's start with the one most people already know about, because it's also the one with the longest and most well-documented history of government confiscation. The United States has its own chapter in this story. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the New Orleans Police Department and National Guard conducted door-to-door firearm confiscations from private citizens in dry, unaffected neighborhoods. People who had no intention of leaving and who needed their weapons for self-defense in a city that had effectively lost law enforcement. The legal authority for this was murky at best. The confiscations happened anyway. Many of those firearms were never returned. A lawsuit by the NRA and Second Amendment Foundation ultimately resulted in a Louisiana law prohibiting such confiscations during declared emergencies, but the damage had already been done. Internationally, the pattern is even more consistent. In Nazi Germany, the 1938 Weapons Act prohibited Jews from owning firearms, a policy that was systematically enforced as part of a broader campaign of disarmament before deportation. In the Soviet Union, private firearm ownership was tightly controlled from the early years of the regime, with periodic sweeps to collect unregistered weapons. In Australia's 1996 mandatory buyback following the Port Arthur massacre, over 650,000 legally owned firearms were surrendered. A confiscation that was state-mandated and compensated, but a confiscation nonetheless. How people have historically protected firearms. Disassembly and distribution across multiple locations is the most common approach. A barrel stored separately from a receiver stored separately from a stock is not a functional firearm under most legal definitions and is much harder to identify as such. Underground caching in sealed waterproof containers is a documented practice with a long history. PVC pipe sealed with end caps and buried below frost line with appropriate moisture-absorbing desiccant inside will protect a disassembled firearm for years. The practical reality is that registration creates a list, and a list is a confiscation roadmap. Every historical episode of mass firearm confiscation has relied on registration records to know who had what and where. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's how it worked in practice, documented in the historical record. Thing 9. Gold, silver, and precious metals. This one surprises people more than it should, given that it happened in the United States within living memory of many people's grandparents. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, which required American citizens to surrender most of their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve by May 1, 1933. The compensation was set at $20.67 per troy ounce, the official price. Within months of the confiscation, the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 revalued gold to $35 per ounce, which meant everyone who had complied with the order had effectively handed the government a 69% premium on their metal. Those who held onto their gold illegally made out considerably better. Exceptions to Executive Order 6102 included gold used in industry, dentistry, and the arts, as well as numismatic coins with recognized collectible value. Specifically, coins with recognized rare coin value were not required to be surrendered. This exception is why a significant number of people today hold rare or pre-1933 U.S. gold coins rather than bullion. Numismatic coins have historically enjoyed a degree of protection that raw bullion does not. The same pattern has appeared in other crisis contexts. During World War II, various European governments under Nazi occupation had their gold reserves seized. The Bank of France's gold was partially evacuated before the German advance, but the process was chaotic. The National Bank of Belgium managed to ship a substantial portion of its gold to the United States and Africa before the occupation. The gold that stayed behind was systematically looted. Hungary's gold reserves, including the famous Hungarian gold train, were seized at the end of the war, intercepted by U.S. Army forces in Austria, and the subsequent disposition of that gold became a source of controversy that lasted decades. The pattern in private confiscation is equally consistent. In Hungary, in 1945 and 1946, as the country experienced the worst hyperinflation ever recorded in history, prices doubling roughly every 15 hours at the peak, the government simultaneously demanded the surrender of foreign currency and precious metals. People who had stored gold specifically to protect against currency collapse found themselves being asked to surrender the very asset that was protecting them at a government-mandated price denominated in a currency that was evaporating. How to think about protecting precious metals. Physical separation and concealment matter more than legal structures in a genuine confiscation scenario. Safe deposit boxes are among the worst places to store gold in a government confiscation situation. They are accessible to authorities with appropriate legal orders and have been targeted in historical confiscation scenarios. Home storage, properly concealed, and geographic distribution across multiple locations are the strategies that have historically worked better. Numismatic coins rather than bullion present a more ambiguous target under most historical confiscation frameworks. Silver has generally received less attention than gold in confiscation scenarios, making it a practical alternative for physical precious metal storage that carries a somewhat lower profile. And the more locations your metal is in, the more of it survives any single confiscation event. That's not complicated math, but it's math that people consistently fail to apply before they need to. Thing 8. Food stockpiles and agricultural production. Food is power. Any government managing a crisis understands this at an instinctive level, which is why food control is one of the earliest and most consistent features of emergency governance. The Soviet Union's grain requisitioning policies of the early 1930s are the most extreme example in the 20th century. The forced collectivization campaign stripped grain from Ukrainian and Kazakh farmers, sometimes taking seed grain needed for the next year's planting, in quantities that created famine conditions. The Holodomor, recognized as a genocide by Ukraine and numerous other countries, killed millions. The mechanism was state-controlled food seizure. Less extreme, but structurally similar policies appeared throughout both world wars. The U.S. Food Administration, headed by Herbert Hoover during World War I, encouraged voluntary food conservation, but operated in the context of government authority to regulate food distribution. During World War II, rationing systems in Britain, the United States, and across occupied Europe gave governments direct control over food access. More recently, Venezuela's food crisis under the Maduro government led to a system of clap boxes, government-controlled food distribution packages, that effectively made the government the primary food source for a significant portion of the population. Access to clap boxes became tied to political compliance. That's food as a control mechanism operating in the 21st century. How people have historically protected food supplies. Concealment within structures is the oldest method. False walls, buried caches, hidden root cellars that don't appear on any building plan. In the Soviet context, peasants hid grain in pits under floors, in haystacks, in household objects. The food that survived was the food that was invisible. Diversification of storage locations matters enormously. A single large cache is a single point of failure. Small caches distributed across a property, a farm, or a network of trusted individuals are much harder to fully eliminate. Growing food that doesn't look like food is a related concept. Perennial food plants integrated into landscaping, fruit trees that appear ornamental, root vegetables that leave no visible surface signature. All of this creates food security that is genuinely difficult to inventory or confiscate. Thing 7. Communications equipment. Control the information, control the population. This is not a modern insight. It predates broadcast media by centuries, but the specific tools change with the technology. And in every major crisis of the modern era, communications equipment capable of bypassing government-controlled channels has been a priority target. During World War II, Nazi-occupied countries throughout Europe required civilians to surrender their radio receivers. In the Netherlands, the occupation authorities ordered radio confiscation in 1943. In Norway, approximately 300,000 radios were confiscated. The purpose was straightforward: BBC broadcasts and Allied radio transmissions were providing occupied populations with accurate information about the war that contradicted German propaganda, and the occupiers wanted that channel closed. People hid radios in remarkable ways: inside furniture, behind false panels, in outbuildings, buried in gardens wrapped in oilcloth. The Dutch resistance maintained hidden radio networks that transmitted intelligence to London throughout the occupation. Those radios were among the most carefully protected objects in occupied Europe precisely because their value was so high. In more recent history, authoritarian governments have targeted satellite phones, encrypted communication devices, and radio equipment capable of communicating outside controlled networks. Myanmar's military junta, following the 2021 coup, specifically targeted satellite internet equipment and VPN usage as threats to information control. The modern equivalent of the hidden radio is a combination of technologies: shortwave receivers for receiving outside broadcasts, amateur radio equipment for two-way communication, and encrypted digital communication tools for situations where internet access exists but is monitored. None of these require large physical footprints. A quality shortwave receiver fits in a shoebox. A basic amateur radio setup fits in a backpack. The modern equivalent of the hidden radio is a combination of technologies: shortwave receivers for receiving outside broadcasts, amateur radio equipment for two-way communication, and encrypted digital communication tools for situations where internet access exists but is monitored. None of these require large physical footprints. A quality shortwave receiver fits in a shoebox. A basic amateur radio setup fits in a backpack. Concealment for communications equipment follows the same logic as any other sensitive item. Multiple locations, no documentation connecting you to the equipment, and a cover story for anything that might be discovered. A shortwave radio stored next to a collection of vintage electronics is a hobby item. A shortwave radio in a dedicated communications kit with antenna wire and frequency guides reads differently to anyone conducting a search. One additional layer worth understanding: amateur radio licenses create a documented record of who is authorized to transmit on specific frequencies. In a confiscation or monitoring scenario, that documentation is a liability. The practical response, particularly for receive-only capability, is that no license is required to listen. A shortwave receiver can be operated without any documentation whatsoever, which makes it among the cleanest concealment scenarios on this list. You are not hiding illegal activity. You are protecting a legal activity from becoming a documented vulnerability. Thing 6. Fuel and energy reserves. Gasoline, diesel, propane, and heating oil have been subject to government control, rationing, and outright requisition in crisis scenarios more often than most people realize. During World War II, gasoline rationing in the United States began in May 1942. Civilian drivers were issued ration books with stickers designating their allowance. An A sticker provided the basic allowance of 4 gallons per week, while workers in essential industries received more. The Office of Price Administration enforced the system, and black markets for ration coupons developed almost immediately. In occupied Europe, fuel was effectively entirely redirected to military use. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo created fuel shortages across the United States that led to odd-even rationing in many states. You could only purchase gasoline on days corresponding to the last digit of your license plate. Lines at gas stations stretched for hours. Some stations ran dry entirely. Venezuela's fuel crisis under the Maduro government created a situation where gasoline, in a major oil-producing country, became scarcer than almost anywhere else in the world, with citizens waiting days in line for fuel that government officials accessed freely. Fuel became a patronage commodity. How to maintain fuel reserves in a crisis context. Rotation is the fundamental principle of fuel storage. Fuel stored without proper additives degrades, and storing large quantities that go bad is worse than storing nothing. Treated diesel stores significantly longer than gasoline. Properly treated diesel can remain usable for several years under good storage conditions. Propane stores indefinitely in sealed tanks. making it the most crisis-stable common fuel. Underground storage of fuel is the most concealed option, but carries significant regulatory and safety considerations depending on jurisdiction. Distributed storage, smaller quantities in multiple locations, reduces the risk of total loss to a single confiscation event. Thing 5. Cash and financial assets. When a financial crisis hits, banks close, account balances freeze, transfer limits appear. This is not a conspiracy theory. It happened in Cyprus in 2013, in Greece in 2015, in Argentina in 2001, and in Lebanon starting in 2019, in a bank freeze that as of this writing has still not been fully resolved. In Cyprus in 2013, as part of a European Union bailout, deposits over 100,000 euros in the two largest banks were subject to a levy, meaning a portion was simply taken to recapitalize the banks. Accounts were frozen during the negotiation process. Capital controls limiting withdrawals remained in place for years afterward. In Argentina's 2001 crisis, the government implemented the corralito, a restriction on cash withdrawals that limited Argentines to 250 pesos per week from their own accounts. People who had saved in dollars because they didn't trust the peso found those dollar accounts converted to pesos at an unfavorable official rate. The middle class lost a significant portion of its savings within weeks. As economist Hernando de Soto has noted about asset protection in unstable economies, the poor are not the problem. The poor are the solution. They have learned to protect what little they have through informal systems that the formal economy ignores. Informal asset protection, physical cash outside the banking system, assets held in alternative forms, is not fringe behavior. It is rational behavior in environments where financial institutions have demonstrated they cannot be trusted to preserve access to deposits. Physical cash held outside the banking system has historically been the first line of defense against bank freezes. The practical concealment question is less about hiding from confiscation. Cash in hand is rarely subject to outright government seizure in non-extreme scenarios, and more about protection from theft and from the inflation that typically accompanies crisis conditions. Diversification across currencies, physical precious metals, and assets with tangible value outside the financial system is the structural approach that has historically preserved wealth through financial crises better than any single strategy. Thing 4. Medical supplies and prescription medications. This one tends to get overlooked in crisis preparedness conversations, which is strange given how consistently medical supplies become controlled commodities in emergency situations. During COVID-19, governments around the world invoked emergency powers to commandeer personal protective equipment, ventilators, and medical supplies from private businesses and healthcare facilities. In the United States, FEMA invoked the Defense Production Act to redirect N95 respirators, surgical masks, and other PPE from private distributors to federal stockpiles. Some states had shipments of medical supplies intercepted and redirected by federal authorities. This was not illegal under emergency powers frameworks. It was exactly what those frameworks were designed to permit. In Venezuela, medicine shortages became so severe that the government's own health ministry stopped publishing statistics on medication availability. NGOs documented shortages of basic antibiotics, insulin, and chemotherapy drugs. What medical supplies existed flowed through government channels, and in many cases were distributed based on political affiliation. Prescription medications present a specific challenge. They require prescriptions, which means a documented paper trail connecting specific individuals to specific drugs. In a scenario where medications become rationed or controlled, that trail can work against you. Building a stockpile of prescription medications requires a relationship with a physician willing to prescribe ahead of need, a legitimate medical practice known as maintenance prescribing, and a storage system that protects the medications from temperature extremes and moisture. Over-the-counter medications with broad utility, antifungals, anti-parasitic medications, high-dose vitamins, pain management medications can be stockpiled without prescription requirements while they remain accessible. The concealment principle is mundane. Medications stored in an organized, labeled, and rotated medical kit in a location that doesn't announce itself as a significant stockpile. The rotation principle matters enormously here. Medications that are expired are largely useless, and a medical stockpile that hasn't been actively rotated is a false sense of security. The practical model is to buy ahead of current need, use from the front of the stockpile, and replace from the back. Exactly the same approach used by any serious emergency preparedness operation. Medications that require refrigeration present a separate challenge in a grid-down scenario and should be supplemented with alternatives that are stable at room temperature wherever medically possible. There's also a knowledge dimension that no amount of stockpiled medication can replace, knowing how to use what you have. A supply of wound care materials is considerably more valuable in the hands of someone who has taken a wilderness first aid course than in the hands of someone who hasn't. Medical training is itself a form of asset that cannot be confiscated, cannot be destroyed in a fire, and cannot be found in a search. It goes where you go. Thing 3. Land and property. This one operates on a different timeline than most items on this list, but it belongs here because it has happened, legally, systematically, and at scale, in ways that left affected populations with essentially no recourse. The Soviet collectivization of agriculture between 1929 and 1933 transferred private farmland to collective ownership on a scale that had no precedent in history. Roughly 25 million individual farming households were consolidated into approximately 250,000 collective farms. Those who resisted, the so-called kulaks, were subject to deportation, labor camps, or execution. The land itself was simply taken, less catastrophically but structurally similar. Zimbabwe's fast-track land reform program, initiated in 2000 under Robert Mugabe, resulted in the seizure of approximately 4,000 white-owned commercial farms over several years. Compensation was promised, but largely not delivered. The agricultural sector collapsed, contributing to hyperinflation that reached an estimated 79.6 billion% month-on-month by November 2008, according to the Cato Institute's analysis. In the United States, eminent domain, the government's legal power to take private property for public use with compensation, has been used in ways that stretch the definition of public use. The Supreme Court's 2005 ruling in Kelo v. City of New London allowed a Connecticut city to seize private homes and transfer the land to private developers for economic development purposes. The project for which the homes were seized was ultimately never built. Protection of real property from government action is primarily a legal and political challenge rather than a concealment challenge. You can't hide a farm. What people have historically done, complex ownership structures, trusts, and legal entities that add layers between an individual's name and the property title. Geographic diversification, owning smaller parcels in different jurisdictions rather than a single large holding in one, reduces the risk of total loss to a single policy action. Thing 2. Skilled labor and human capital. This one is genuinely underappreciated, possibly because it sounds abstract until you consider what it actually means in practice. Governments in crisis have repeatedly drafted, conscripted, and redirected skilled workers with minimal regard for individual preference. Military conscription is the most obvious example. Young men compelled to serve regardless of their civilian skills or personal circumstances. But skilled labor conscription goes well beyond military service. During World War II, the Soviet Union operated a system of labor conscription that directed workers to specific industries and locations based on state needs rather than individual choice. Factory workers, engineers, scientists, and agricultural laborers were assigned to roles and locations by the state. The German Arbeitseinsatz program during the same period conscripted forced labor from occupied countries. Estimates suggest approximately 8.7 million foreign workers were in Germany by 1944, the majority working under varying degrees of coercion. In less extreme form, emergency powers in democratic countries have included authority to direct private businesses and their workforces toward emergency priorities. The Defense Production Act in the United States includes provisions that can compel private companies to prioritize government contracts, effectively conscripting the productive capacity, if not the specific individuals, of private enterprises. The protection of human capital, skills, expertise, and productive capacity from state direction is primarily a question of how visible and how identifiable specific skills are. Specialists whose expertise is publicly documented and whose location is known are easier to conscript than generalists whose knowledge is broad, informal, and not attached to a specific institutional role. This is not an argument against developing expertise. It is an argument for developing expertise that is genuinely diverse and not entirely dependent on institutional frameworks that can themselves be seized or redirected. As historical records of wartime resistance movements show, the most valuable members of those networks were often people with skills that appeared ordinary, but proved extraordinary under pressure. Mechanics who could repair any vehicle, nurses who could treat wounds with whatever was available, farmers who knew the land well enough to move people through it undetected. Thing 1. Information and documentation. The most important thing any government seizes in a crisis is something most people never think to protect: information. Specifically, records about who you are, what you own, where you live, what you believe, who you associate with, and what you've done. This isn't abstract. In Nazi-occupied Europe, census records, tax records, property registries, and church baptismal records were used to identify Jewish families, political opponents, and resistance members. The administrative apparatus of the Holocaust was built substantially on existing government record systems. Raoul Hilberg, whose monumental work, The Destruction of the European Jews, documented the Holocaust's bureaucratic mechanics in exhaustive detail, made clear that the machinery of identification and record-keeping was as essential to the process as any physical instrument of violence. In Cambodia, under the Khmer Rouge, the regime's effort to identify and eliminate educated people, the so-called new people, who had lived in cities before the revolution, relied on documentation, on what records existed about individuals, and on information extracted under torture. People who could credibly present themselves as illiterate peasants survived in circumstances where people who were identified as teachers, doctors, or government workers did not. The practical modern implications. Digital records are the most vulnerable because they are the most comprehensive and the most accessible. Your phone contains your location history, your communications, your social connections, your financial activity, and your reading habits. All of that is potentially accessible to a sufficiently motivated authority. Encrypted communication applications, stored offline rather than in cloud services, and minimal digital footprint are the modern equivalents of the hidden radio. Physical documentation, birth certificates, property deeds, financial records, medical records, should be stored in multiple locations, including at least one that is not in your primary residence. A waterproof, fireproof container with copies of essential documents stored at a trusted location outside your home is a basic precaution that requires almost no effort relative to its value. The deeper principle is that anonymity and ambiguity are forms of protection. People who are clearly inventoried, whose assets, skills, political views, and associations are comprehensively documented in accessible records, are easy targets. People who are harder to fully account for are harder to fully control. This is not paranoia. It is a lesson written in the history of every crisis documented in this video, across every culture and every century that has experienced serious disruption of normal governance. Every item on this list has been seized, controlled, or targeted in documented historical crises. None of this is speculative. The governments that did these things were not uniquely evil in most cases. They were governments under pressure, making decisions they justified to themselves as necessary, using the tools and records they had available. The mechanisms they used were legal under the emergency frameworks they operated within. That's worth sitting with. The preparation that matters isn't stockpiling any single item, it's understanding the pattern, knowing which things attract attention first, which things have historically been protected successfully, and what the difference is between visible vulnerability and quiet resilience. The people who navigated historical crises best were rarely the ones who fought the hardest against the current. They were usually the ones who had thought clearly in advance about what they had, what it was worth protecting, and how to make it less visible to systems that were looking for exactly those things. None of what's been discussed here is illegal. Storing food, owning precious metals, maintaining communications equipment, keeping physical cash, protecting your documentation. All of it is entirely legal in normal times in most democratic countries. The time to do these things is precisely when they are legal, unremarkable, and available. Waiting until a crisis makes them urgent is waiting until they are also difficult, expensive, and potentially dangerous. That's the lesson every item on this list teaches, and it's the lesson that history keeps writing over and over for anyone paying attention. If this gave you something to think about, or something to act on, hit the like button and subscribe. We cover the history that most people either never learned or quietly forgot. And right now, that history is more relevant than it's been in a long time. There's more coming, and you won't want to miss it.